The lonely widow gave the homeless man her scarf with trembling hands, never imagining that this simple act of kindness would unravel a story far greater than she could have dreamed. The soft cashmere slipped from her fingers like a whisper of her past life, warm, comforting, and now surrendered to someone who seemed to need it more. Margaret Fletcher stood at the corner of Maple and Fifth, the December wind biting at her exposed neck as she watched the man wrap her late husband's scarf around his weathered face. 67 years old with silver hair that once made Richard call her his moonlight girl, Margaret now walked through life like a ghost, haunting the same streets she and her husband had loved for 43 years. 372 days. That's how long Richard had been gone. Not that she was counting, except she was with every heartbeat, with every morning she woke to cold sheets and silence. The homeless man hadn't asked for the scarf. He'd simply been there, huddled against the brick wall of Perlman's bakery, his fingerless gloves clutching a paper cup with a few scattered coins. Something in his eyes, a dignity perhaps, or a familiar sorrow, had caught Margaret's attention as she left the bakery with a single almond croissant in a paper bag. Richard's favorite, a Thursday tradition she couldn't seem to break. "Thank you," the man had said, his voice surprisingly gentle, cultured even. "It's quite beautiful." Margaret had nodded, unable to speak past the sudden thickness in her throat, and continued her solitary walk home. The scarf had been cashmere, expensive, the color of forest pines. Richard had worn it every winter for a decade. Giving it away should have felt like betrayal, but somehow it had felt like release. Now, as the first snowflakes of the season began their lazy descent from a pearl-gray sky, Margaret wondered what Richard would think of her impulsive gesture. He had always been the generous one, the one who invited strangers for holiday meals, who remembered the names of every server at their favorite restaurant, who carried extra dollar bills specifically for the homeless people they passed. Margaret's small brick townhouse waited at the end of Chestnut Street, windows dark and uninviting. She'd once filled those windows with candles during the holiday season, a warm beacon calling Richard home from his architectural firm downtown. Now, the boxes of decorations remained stacked in the basement, gathering dust alongside Richard's drafting table and collection of architectural journals. Inside, the silence wrapped around her like a shroud. Margaret hung her coat on the rack by the door, leaving the empty hook where Richard's coat should be, and placed the almond croissant on a plate. The ritual continued, one teacup, one saucer, one napkin folded into a perfect triangle. She'd set the table for one for 372 days, and each time felt like another small death. The phone rang, startling her from her precise movements. Probably Claire, her daughter in Phoenix, with her weekly check-in call. Claire, who worried, who suggested senior communities and companion services, who couldn't understand why her mother insisted on rattling around in this too-big house in a Massachusetts winter. "Hello, dear," Margaret answered, settling into Richard's armchair by the window. "Mom, how are you holding up? It's starting to snow there, isn't it?" Claire's voice carried the warmth of the Arizona desert, concern wrapped in sunshine. "Just flurries. Nothing to worry about." Margaret watched the snowflakes dance past her window, picking up speed now. "I've been thinking about the community center. They need volunteers for their art program." A small lie. She hadn't thought about it until this very moment, but the community center was just 3 blocks away, and she had passed their "volunteers needed" sign every day for weeks. "Really? Mom, that's wonderful!" The relief in Claire's voice was palpable. "You were always good with art, and it would be nice for you to get out more." The conversation drifted to Claire's children, to her husband's promotion, to the cactus garden they were installing in their backyard. Margaret made appropriate responses while her mind wandered back to the homeless man and his gentle thank you. Those weren't the calloused hands of someone who had lived on the streets for years. They were artists' hands, sensitive, expressive, even in their stillness. After promising Claire she would look into the volunteer position tomorrow, Margaret hung up and carried her half-eaten croissant to the kitchen trash. The snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the street in pristine white. The thought of the homeless man huddled against the bakery wall, even with Richard's scarf, sent an uncomfortable pang through her chest. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of Richard walking ahead of her in the snow, his green scarf trailing behind him like a path she couldn't quite follow. Morning arrived with 10 inches of snow and a city temporarily hushed under its weight. Margaret woke earlier than usual, a purpose threading through her movements as she dressed in her warmest layers. She made a thermos of coffee, packed Richard's other scarf, a red plaid one he'd seldom worn, and added a paper bag containing a blueberry muffin and an apple. The walk to Perlman's bakery was challenging, the sidewalks only partially cleared, but Margaret moved with a determination she hadn't felt in months. The corner where the homeless man had sat was empty, swept clean of snow as if in preparation for the day's business. Disappointment settled heavy in her stomach. Foolish to think he'd be in the same spot, especially after a snowstorm. Margaret stood uncertainly, the thermos warm against her gloved hands, the muffin and scarf tucked in her tote bag. "The gentleman you're looking for moved to the underpass by the library," said a voice behind her. Mr. Perlman stood in the doorway of his bakery, apron dusted with flour, kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "When it snows, they seek better shelter." "I wasn't," Margaret began, then stopped. "Thank you." The library was 6 blocks away, in the opposite direction from her home. Margaret hesitated only briefly before turning toward it, careful of the slippery sidewalks. By the time she reached the stone underpass that tunneled beneath Fairmont Avenue behind the library, her toes were numb and her breath came in cloudy puffs. A small encampment had formed beneath the arched stone ceiling, 3 tents, a collection of tarps, several huddled figures. Margaret stood at the edge of the shadow line where clean snow met the cleared ground of the underpass, suddenly unsure. Which one was he? Would he even remember her? A figure detached itself from the group and approached her, not the man she sought, but a woman with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes. "Can we help you, ma'am?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentle wariness of someone used to being told to move along. "I'm looking for someone," Margaret said, clutching her tote bag tighter. "A man. I gave him a green scarf yesterday." The woman smiled, revealing a missing tooth. "Leo. He's in the blue tent, probably drawing. Man never stops, even in this weather." She nodded toward a small dome tent at the far end of the underpass. "You family?" "No," Margaret said quickly. "Just bringing him some coffee. And another scarf." The woman's eyes softened with understanding. "Well, that's mighty kind. Go on then. Leo could use a friend." Margaret picked her way carefully through the small camp, nodding politely to the others who watched her with curious eyes. At the blue tent, she hesitated, then called softly, "Hello? It's Margaret, from the bakery yesterday." A rustling sound, then the tent flap unzipped. The man from yesterday emerged, her green scarf still wrapped around his neck, a pencil tucked behind his ear. Recognition, then surprise, flickered across his face. "The scarf lady?" he said, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I brought coffee," Margaret said, holding out the thermos like an offering. "And a muffin. It's blueberry. I hope that's all right." He accepted the thermos with those expressive hands she remembered, the fingers long and tapered despite their redness from cold. "That's extraordinarily kind. Would you like to come in?" "It's not much, but it's out of the wind." Margaret hesitated, a lifetime of caution warring with an unexpected desire to continue this strange connection. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "Please," he said, gesturing to the tent. "I haven't had a visitor in, well, a very long time." The tent was surprisingly neat, if sparse. A sleeping bag lay on an insulated pad, a backpack served as a pillow, and a plastic storage bin held what appeared to be clothing. But what caught Margaret's eye were the drawings, dozens of them, pinned to the tent walls with binder clips, spread across the small open space of the floor, tucked into a weathered portfolio. Charcoal landscapes, pencil portraits, ink sketches of city scenes, all executed with a mastery that took her breath away. Margaret sank to her knees at the tent entrance, forgetting the cold, forgetting her purpose, lost in the beauty before her. "These are extraordinary," she whispered, reaching out to touch the corner of a drawing showing Perlman's bakery in the soft light of dawn, every brick and shadow rendered with loving precision. "Thank you," he said, pouring coffee into the thermos cup and offering it to her first. "It keeps me sane, or something close to it." "I'm Margaret," she said, accepting the cup and wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Margaret Fletcher." "Leonardo Diaz?" he replied with a slight nod that seemed almost like a bow. "Most people call me Leo. Leo, like Leonardo da Vinci." The name suited him somehow, this man with artist's hands and eyes that saw beyond surfaces. "How long have you been—" Margaret gestured vaguely at the tent, unsure of the polite terminology. "Homeless?" Leo supplied with a wry smile. 3 years, give or take a few months. Before that, I had a studio in the Arts District. Before that, galleries in New York and Boston. He shrugged, a fluid movement that spoke of acceptance rather than self-pity. Life takes unexpected turns. Margaret nodded, thinking of Richard's sudden heart attack in the garden on a perfect spring morning. Yes, it does. They sat in companionable silence, passing the single cup of coffee between them, while the snow continued to fall beyond the shelter of the underpass. Margaret found herself studying Leo's face. The deep-set eyes that must have been startlingly blue in his youth, now faded to a softer hue. The silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a short ponytail, the lines that mapped a life of both laughter and hardship around his mouth and eyes. "You're an artist," she said finally. "A real one, I mean. Not just a homeless man with a hobby?" Leo finished, but there was no bitterness in his tone. "Yes, in another life. I had exhibitions, reviews in the Times, collectors who paid obscene amounts for my work." He gestured to the drawings surrounding them. "Now I trade sketches for coffee or sandwiches. Art is art, regardless of where it happens." Margaret reached into her tote bag and withdrew the red plaid scarf. "I brought this. My husband's. He ... He passed last year. He didn't wear this one much. Said it was too bright." Leo accepted the scarf, running his fingers over the soft wool. "I'm sorry about your husband, and grateful for your kindness." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "But I have to ask, why me? There are many people in need. What made you stop yesterday?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Why had she given a stranger her husband's beloved scarf? Why had she trekked through snow to find him again? "You have kind eyes," she said finally. "And I've been lonely. Richard, my husband, he was the generous one. Always helping others. I think perhaps I wanted to feel close to him again." She looked down at her gloved hands. "That sounds selfish, doesn't it?" "Not selfish," Leo said gently. "Human. We all seek connection, even in grief. Especially in grief." A call from outside the tent interrupted them, the woman who had directed Margaret earlier. "Leo! The library's opening up the community room for a snow shelter. They're sending a van in 10 minutes. Leo nodded his acknowledgement, then turned back to Margaret. "Duty calls. The library opens their meeting room during severe weather. Cots, hot food, showers." He began carefully gathering his drawings, sliding them into the weathered portfolio with practiced movements. "Thank you for the coffee and scarf. And the company." Margaret helped him pack, handling the drawings with reverence. "The community center on Maple is looking for art instructors," she said impulsively. "Volunteers. For their after-school program." Leo paused in his packing, a flash of something, hope, perhaps, crossing his face before he shuttered it. "They wouldn't want someone like me teaching children." "They might," Margaret countered, surprising herself with her certainty. "If someone vouched for you, someone like me." Leo studied her face, searching for something, mockery, pity, false kindness. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Perhaps. If someone like you vouched for me." They emerged from the tent to find the other homeless residents already breaking camp, packing their meager belongings with the efficiency of practice. A white van with the city library logo idled at the entrance to the underpass. "Tomorrow," Margaret said, handing Leo her address written on the bakery receipt she'd found in her pocket. "Come at 10. We'll go to the community center together." As she turned to leave, Leo called after her. "Why are you doing this, Margaret?" She looked back, snow catching in her silver hair, eyes clear and direct. "Because art should be shared, and because no one should be alone in winter." The walk home felt different somehow, the cold less biting, the solitude less empty. For the first time in 373 days, Margaret had made plans for tomorrow that had nothing to do with grief. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the snow glistening under a brilliant blue sky. Margaret woke with a nervousness she hadn't felt in years, checking the clock repeatedly as she moved through her morning routine. She put out 2 mugs instead of 1, set 2 places at the breakfast table, opened the curtains to let the sunlight stream in. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margaret smoothed her sweater, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and opened the door. Leo stood on her porch, backpack slung over one shoulder, portfolio under his arm. He wore both scarves, the green one around his neck, the red plaid one wrapped around his waist like a belt. His face was freshly shaved, his hair neatly combed back. He looked like a different man in the bright morning light, still weathered, still bearing the marks of hard years, but with a dignity that transcended his circumstances. "Good morning," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I wasn't sure you'd really want me to come." "I'm glad you did," Margaret replied, stepping back to invite him in. "I made tea. And there's toast if you're hungry." Leo entered her home with the careful steps of someone accustomed to taking up as little space as possible. His eyes, however, moved everywhere, taking in the high ceilings, the built-in bookshelves, the architectural details that had made Richard fall in love with the townhouse 30 years ago. "Beautiful craftsmanship," he murmured, running a hand along the oak banister of the staircase. 1920s? 1923? Margaret confirmed, leading him to the kitchen. "Richard, my husband, he was an architect. He restored many of the original features himself." The kitchen, flooded with morning light from the bay window, seemed suddenly brighter with another person in it. Margaret poured tea while Leo settled his portfolio carefully against the wall. They sat at the small breakfast table, two strangers connected by scarves and kindness, neither quite sure of the next step. "I called the community center this morning," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "They're desperate for volunteers for their art program. Budget cuts, you know. The director said we could come by this afternoon." Leo wrapped his hands around the mug of tea, the artist's hands that had created the masterful drawings. "You didn't tell them about me? My situation?" "I told them I had a friend who was an artist interested in volunteering," Margaret said simply. "The rest is your story to tell or keep as you choose." Something in Leo's face softened, a guard lowering. "Thank you for that. For the choice." He hesitated, then opened his backpack and removed a folded piece of paper. "I made this. For you." He handed her the paper, which turned out to be a drawing, her standing in the snow, offering the thermos of coffee. The delicate lines captured not just her appearance but something of her essence, the determined set of her shoulders, the tentative hope in her eyes, the grace in her extended hand. "Oh," Margaret breathed, a hand going to her heart. No one had drawn her in decades, not since art school when she and Richard had been young, when she had dreamed of being a painter before life led her toward teaching and then motherhood. "Do you like it?" Leo asked, watching her face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You've made me beautiful." "I only drew what I saw," Leo said simply. Margaret carefully set the drawing aside and cleared her throat. "We should eat something before we go to the center. And perhaps," she hesitated, then continued with determination, "perhaps you'd like to use the shower. And I have some of Richard's clothes. He was taller than you, but—" Leo's face showed a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude warring with pride, need battling with dignity. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Margaret said firmly. "It's what neighbors do." An hour later, Leo emerged from the guest bathroom transformed. Dressed in Richard's charcoal slacks, rolled slightly at the cuffs, and a navy sweater, hair still damp from the shower, he looked like what he truly was: an artist, a professional, a man of talent and education who had fallen on impossibly hard times. "Better?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "Very distinguished," Margaret assured him, ignoring the pang she felt at seeing Richard's clothes filled with life again. "The community center director will be impressed." They walked the 6 blocks to the Maple Street Community Center together, Leo carrying his portfolio, Margaret matching her steps to his. The city was coming back to life after the snowstorm, plows clearing streets, shopkeepers shoveling sidewalks, children dragging sleds toward the hill in Robinson Park. "I lived near here once," Leo said as they passed a row of brownstones on Cherry Lane. "A lifetime ago. I had a top-floor apartment with north light, perfect for painting." "What happened?" Margaret asked gently, sensing he needed to tell his story before they reached the center. Leo was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, meant only for her. "Success, then failure." The usual story. "I had galleries, exhibitions, reviews, made good money for a while. Then the market crashed in 2008, and the art world changed. My style fell out of favor, too traditional, too representational. I tried to adapt, but—" he shrugged. "Then my wife left, took our savings. I started drinking too much, lost my teaching position at the university. One thing led to another, and eventually there was nowhere to go but the streets." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. "Don't be," Leo replied. "It was a harsh education, but valuable. I learned who I really was when everything else was stripped away." He patted his portfolio. "And I never stopped drawing. That's something they couldn't take." The community center was a converted Victorian mansion, its turrets and gables now housing programs for everyone from toddlers to seniors. Inside, the high-ceilinged rooms buzzed with activity, seniors playing cards in what had once been a formal parlor, teenagers shooting pool in the converted dining room, the smell of vegetable soup wafting from the kitchen that served hot lunches to anyone who needed one. Ms. Abernathy, the center's director, met them in the former library, now lined with children's artwork and educational posters. A brisk woman in her 50s with practical shoes and a no-nonsense manner, she shook both their hands firmly. "Mrs. Fletcher, a pleasure. And this must be your artist friend." She turned an assessing gaze on Leo, who stood straight under her scrutiny, portfolio held like a shield. "Leonardo Diaz," he said, his voice taking on a professional tone Margaret hadn't heard before. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss your art program, Ms." Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly at his name. "Diaz? The Leonardo Diaz who had that exhibition at the Whitney about 15 years ago? The Urban Landscape series?" Leo blinked, clearly surprised to be recognized. "Yes, that was me, Ms." Abernathy broke into a wide smile. "Well, I studied your work in graduate school. Your use of light in urban settings was revolutionary." She gestured to the chairs arranged around a large table. "Please sit. Tell me what brings an artist of your caliber to our humble center." The next hour passed in a blur of discussion about art curricula, teaching philosophies, and the needs of the center's children. Leo opened his portfolio, showing Ms. Abernathy his recent work, explaining his belief in teaching traditional drawing skills alongside creative expression. Margaret watched, heart swelling, as the man who had been huddled against a bakery wall yesterday came alive, passionate and articulate about art education. "We can offer a small stipend, Miss?" Abernathy said finally, clearly impressed. "Not much, I'm afraid. Budget constraints. The stipend is less important than the opportunity," Leo said diplomatically. Then, with careful dignity, he added, "However, I should be transparent about my current situation. I've been experiencing housing insecurity for some time. My circumstances are complicated." "Ms." Abernathy's face showed no judgment, only thoughtful consideration. "We have a small apartment above the garage out back. Nothing fancy, just a studio with a kitchenette and bath. It's meant for an on-site caretaker, but we haven't been able to afford one. It would be a fair exchange for teaching 4 classes a week and helping with general maintenance." Leo's hand resting on the table trembled slightly. "That's extremely generous. It's practical." "Ms." Abernathy countered. "We need your skills, you need housing. A fair exchange of value." She stood, extending her hand. "Can you start next week? The apartment needs a thorough cleaning, but it could be ready by Monday." Outside, standing in the winter sunshine on the community center's steps, Leo turned to Margaret, his face a study in disbelief and cautious hope. "Did that really just happen?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Margaret smiled, her own heart lighter than it had been in 374 days. "It really did. Your talent was recognized, as it should be. Because of you," Leo said, reaching out to briefly touch her hand. "Because you saw a person, not just a homeless man. We should celebrate." Margaret said impulsively, "Lunch? My treat." They walked to a small cafe 2 blocks from the center, talking with growing animation about the possibilities of the art program, the studio apartment, the future that had suddenly opened before them. Over soup and sandwiches, they discovered shared interests beyond art, a love of classic films, of poetry, of walking in the early morning when the city was still quiet. "Will you help me set up the classes?" Leo asked as they lingered over coffee. "Your background in teaching would be invaluable." "I'd like that," Margaret said, realizing she meant it. "I've been adrift since Richard died. It would be good to have a purpose again." Leo studied her face, his artist's eye seeing beneath the surface. "You were an artist too, weren't you? Before." Margaret nodded, surprised he had intuited this. "Long ago. I studied painting in college. That's where I met Richard. But then life happened. Teaching job, mortgage, raising Claire. I haven't picked up a brush in decades. Maybe it's time," Leo said gently. "Art has a way of saving us when nothing else can. It saved me even in my darkest times." The week that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Margaret. Each morning, she met Leo at the community center, where they worked together to clean and prepare the small apartment above the garage. Years of dust and neglect required their combined efforts, Margaret scrubbing the kitchenette while Leo patched and painted walls, Leo fixing the leaky bathroom sink while Margaret washed windows and hung curtains she'd brought from home. In the afternoons, they developed the curriculum for the children's art classes, sitting at Margaret's dining room table surrounded by art supplies, reference books, and the sketches Leo made to illustrate different techniques. They worked with an easy rhythm, Leo's expertise in fine art blending seamlessly with Margaret's understanding of educational approaches. The children need to learn foundational skills, Leo insisted, demonstrating a simple method for teaching perspective. But they also need the freedom to express themselves, to make mistakes, to discover their own visual language. Margaret watched his hands as he drew, confident, graceful, bringing worlds into being with a few strokes of charcoal. Something long dormant stirred within her, an old hunger she had suppressed for decades. "I want to draw again," she admitted one evening as they shared a simple dinner of pasta and salad at her kitchen table. "Watching you, it reminds me of how much I loved it once." Leo's face lit up. "I've been hoping you'd say that. Here." He pushed a sketchbook across the table. New, its cream pages waiting. "I got this for you yesterday. A thank you gift." Margaret touched the sketchbook reverently, then looked up at Leo with damp eyes. "No one has encouraged my art since Richard, when we were first married. He built me a studio in the spare bedroom upstairs, but after Claire was born, it became the nursery. I always thought I'd go back to it someday, but life happened." Leo finished for her. "It's never too late, Margaret. Trust me on this." The following Monday, Leo moved into the apartment above the garage, his few possessions, the drawings, the backpack of clothes, a small collection of paperback books salvaged from little free libraries, barely filling the freshly painted space. Margaret helped him settle in, bringing a patchwork quilt for the bed, a French press coffee maker, a vase of winter berries for the small table. "My first real home in 3 years. Leo said, standing in the center of the studio, turning slowly to take it all in. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Margaret replied. "Just teach those children, and keep drawing." The first art class was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. Leo, dressed in Richard's clothes, now officially gifted to him, paced nervously in the community center's art room while Margaret arranged supplies on the tables. "What if they don't like me?" he asked, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Children can sense when an adult is damaged. Children," Margaret said firmly, "can sense when an adult is authentic. Be yourself, Leo. Show them your passion for art. The rest will follow." 8 children arrived for that first class, ranging in age from 7 to 12, all from the surrounding neighborhood. They eyed Leo warily at first, this tall stranger with artist's hands and a formal way of speaking. But as he began to demonstrate how to see shapes within everyday objects, how to translate those shapes onto paper, their wariness transformed into fascination. Margaret sat at the back of the room, ostensibly organizing supplies, but primarily watching the magic unfold. Leo moved from child to child, offering gentle guidance, genuine praise, specific suggestions. He treated their efforts with the same seriousness he would give to any artist, and they responded by trying harder, focusing longer, beaming under his attention. "Look, mister." "Leo!" called Maya, a serious 9-year-old with braids and glasses. "I drew my hand like you showed us." Leo crouched beside her, studying her drawing with respectful attention. "Excellent observation of the negative space between your fingers, Maya. That's a sophisticated technique." By the end of the hour, the children were crowded around Leo, showing him their drawings, asking when they could return, if they could bring friends. Ms. Abernathy, observing from the doorway, gave Margaret a satisfied nod. "You found us a treasure," she said quietly. "That man has a gift for teaching." "He has many gifts," Margaret replied, watching as Leo carefully stored each child's drawing in a portfolio, promising to continue their work next time. After the children left, Leo sank into a chair, emotionally drained but glowing with quiet satisfaction. "They're remarkable," he said, "so open, so eager to learn. I'd forgotten what that feels like." "You're remarkable with them," Margaret said, gathering her coat and bag. "Richard would have loved seeing this. He always said true talent finds its way, no matter what obstacles life presents." Leo walked Margaret home, insisting it was the least he could do after all her help. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, turning the ordinary street into a study of gold and blue. "Will you draw with me?" Leo asked as they reached her doorstep. "Saturday morning, perhaps? The light in the park is beautiful then." Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that, though I'm terribly out of practice." "Art is patient," Leo said with a smile. "It waits for us to return." Saturday dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day that sparkles with possibility. Margaret found her old art supplies in the attic, a wooden case of pencils, a sketchbook yellowed at the edges but still containing blank pages, a set of woodless graphite sticks that left her fingers smudged with their soft darkness. They met at Robinson Park, finding a bench in the sunlight with a view of the duck pond and the Victorian bandstand beyond. Children sledded down the hill in the distance, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. "Start with what you see, not what you think you see," Leo advised, opening his own sketchbook. "Forget the names of things. Don't think tree or bench. See shapes, values, relationships." Margaret's first attempts were hesitant, stiff. Her lines wavered, proportions skewed. Frustration bubbled up. How could she have forgotten something that had once been as natural as breathing? "You're thinking too much," Leo said gently, watching her struggle. "Here." He moved to sit beside her on the bench, his shoulder warm against hers. Taking her hand with the pencil in his, he guided her through a series of fluid strokes. "Feel the movement. Drawing is dancing on paper." Something shifted in Margaret's chest, a door long closed creaking open. She began again, letting the pencil move more freely, focusing on the negative spaces between branches rather than the branches themselves. Slowly, the scene emerged on her paper. Imperfect, yes, but alive in a way her earlier attempts had not been. "There," Leo said softly. "You see, it never leaves us. The ability to see, to translate seeing into marks. It just hibernates sometimes." They drew in companionable silence for over an hour, stopping only when their fingers grew too cold to hold the pencils. Leo insisted on seeing Margaret's completed sketch, examining it with the same respectful attention he'd given the children's work. "Beautiful sensitivity in these lines," he said, pointing to where she'd captured the delicate tracery of bare branches against the winter sky. "You have a natural eye for composition." Margaret felt herself blush like a schoolgirl. "You're too kind." "I'm truthful," Leo corrected. "Always about art." They continued their Saturday drawing sessions throughout January and into February, venturing to different locations as the weather permitted. The grand reading room of the public library, the Victorian greenhouse in the botanical gardens, the marina with its forest of bare masts waiting for spring. Each time, Margaret's confidence grew, her hand remembering old skills, her eyes sharpening once again. Meanwhile, Leo's art classes at the community center flourished. Word spread, and soon he was teaching 3 children's classes and adding an adult class on Thursday evenings. Margaret assisted with the children, then joined as a student for the adult sessions, finding herself among a diverse group of neighborhood residents eager to learn from the remarkable artist who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. Few knew Leo's full story, Ms. Abernathy had maintained his privacy, introducing him simply as an accomplished artist who had joined their staff. But Leo himself was gradually sharing pieces of his past with Margaret, unfolding his history in quiet conversations over tea at her kitchen table or during their walks through the winter city. "I had a daughter," he told her one evening in late February as they sat before the fireplace in her living room, sketchbooks open but temporarily forgotten. "She'd be about 30 now. Her mother took her to California after the divorce. I haven't seen her since she was 10. Margaret's heart ached for him. "Have you tried to find her?" Leo nodded, staring into the flames. "Many times. Even before I lost everything. Her mother remarried. They changed her last name. Then when I became..." He gestured vaguely at himself. I stopped trying. What child wants to discover her father is homeless?" "A father is a father," Margaret said gently. "Circumstances change. Love doesn't..." "Perhaps," Leo acknowledged. "Someday when I'm more established again, when I have something to offer besides shame." "You have your art to offer," Margaret said firmly. "And your heart. Those are worth more than any material success." As winter began its slow surrender to spring, subtle changes appeared in both of them. Leo's face filled out, the deep hollows in his cheeks softening as regular meals restored his health. His posture straightened, shoulders no longer hunched against cold and rejection. He began to accept modest commissions, portraits for community center supporters, illustrations for a local author's children's book, building his professional identity again piece by piece. Margaret found herself smiling more, planning for future days rather than simply enduring the present. She cleared out Richard's home office, transforming it into the art studio he had always intended for her. The room faced east, capturing the morning light that streamed through tall windows. She set up an easel, arranged her growing collection of drawing materials, pinned her sketches to a large corkboard along one wall. He would approve, she told Leo as she showed him the completed space. Richard always wanted me to return to art. He loved you very much, Leo said, studying a photograph of Richard that Margaret had placed on the bookshelf, a candid shot of him laughing, taken on their 40th anniversary trip to Maine. Yes, Margaret agreed, her grief still present but somehow transmuted into something gentler, more bittersweet than raw. We were lucky. I never thanked you properly, Leo said suddenly, turning to face her. For the scarf, for seeing me when I was invisible, for changing my life. You've thanked me 1,000 times, Margaret replied. With your friendship, with bringing art back into my life? Leo shook his head, struggling to find the right words. It's more than that. You restored my dignity. Do you know how rare that is? People give money, food, even shelter. But dignity? That's the thing most often stripped from those of us who fall through society's cracks. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You always had dignity, Leo. I just recognized it. The first true day of spring arrived in late March, a sudden warmth that coaxed crocuses from the soil and buds from the trees. Margaret and Leo celebrated by taking their drawing materials to the botanical garden, where the greenhouse was bursting with early blooms. As they sketched a particularly dramatic orchid, Leo said casually, "The gallery on Hamilton Street is having a small work show next month. Local artists. I've submitted a few pieces." Margaret looked up from her drawing. "Leo, that's wonderful!" "Which pieces?" "The urban landscapes I've been working on." And ... He hesitated, suddenly looking nervous. "The portrait I did of you. The one from the park." Margaret blinked in surprise. Leo had drawn her many times over the past months, but the park portrait was special, a larger piece he had worked on for weeks, refusing to let her see it until it was complete. In it, she stood in the winter sunlight, silver hair illuminated to a halo, face turned slightly upward with an expression of quiet joy. It was how Leo saw her, she realized, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman awakening to life again. "I'm honored," she said softly. "Truly." Leo fidgeted with his pencil. "There's something else. If they sell the pieces, I'll have enough to make a trip to California, to try to find Sophia, my daughter." Margaret reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "That's even better news. She should know the man her father has become." The gallery opening fell on a perfect April evening, the kind that promised summer's eventual arrival. Margaret wore a dress she hadn't touched since before Richard's death, a deep blue silk that brought out the silver in her hair. Leo, dressed in new clothes purchased with his commission earnings, paced nervously in her living room. "What if no one comes?" he fretted. "What if they come but hate the work? Then we'll drink all the free wine ourselves and go for pizza after," Margaret said practically. "But that won't happen. Your work is extraordinary, Leo. Always has been." The gallery was crowded when they arrived, the small space humming with conversation and the gentle clink of wine glasses. Leo's pieces, 5 urban landscapes capturing their city in different lights and weathers, plus the portrait of Margaret, hung on the gallery's north wall, beautifully framed and lit. "Oh, Leo," Margaret breathed, seeing them displayed professionally for the first time. "They're magnificent." Before Leo could respond, the gallery owner approached, a slender woman with artistic silver jewelry and a keen eye. "Mr. Diaz, I'm so pleased you could join us. Your work is generating quite a buzz tonight." Leo straightened, years of professional training taking over despite his nerves. "Thank you for including me, Ms. Barrett. May I introduce Margaret Fletcher? My ... My dear friend and supporter, Ms. Barrett shook Margaret's hand warmly. "A pleasure. I must say, the portrait of you is drawing significant attention. Such emotional depth in a single image." As if to prove her point, a red sold dot appeared beside the portrait within the hour, followed quickly by dots next to 3 of the landscapes. Leo moved through the gallery in a daze, accepting congratulations, discussing his techniques, reconnecting with the art world he had thought lost to him forever. Margaret watched from a quiet corner, heart full. This was always who he was meant to be, this articulate, passionate artist engaging with those who appreciated his vision. The homeless man with the gentle voice had been a temporary state, not his true identity. Late in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the event wound down, Leo found her near the entrance, his face alight with barely contained emotion. "They want to give me a solo show," he said, voice hushed with disbelief. "In the fall, a full exhibition of new work." Margaret's eyes widened. "Leo, that's incredible! The portrait of you sold to a major collector," he continued. "And he's commissioned 2 more pieces. Margaret, I can go to California. I can find Sophia. I can rebuild my life as an artist. Joy bubbled up inside her, alongside a small, unexpected pang. I'm so happy for you, she said sincerely. You deserve this recognition. You always did. Leo studied her face, reading her as easily as she now read his. You're worried I'll leave? Margaret shook her head quickly. No, not at all. You should go to California, find your daughter. That's important. For a visit, Leo clarified, taking her hand. To reconnect with Sophia if she'll see me? But my life is here now. My teaching. My new patrons. He paused, squeezing her fingers gently. My dearest friend, who gave me a scarf when I had nothing, and dignity when I'd forgotten what it felt like. Relief and something warmer flooded through Margaret. I'm glad, she said simply. I've grown rather used to our Saturday drawing sessions. They left the gallery hand in hand, stepping into the gentle spring evening. The city spread before them, not as separate worlds of comfort and deprivation, but as one community where second chances were possible, where art could bridge divides, where a simple scarf could begin a journey of mutual salvation. I've been thinking, Leo said as they walked slowly toward home, about Richard's scarf. Which one? Margaret asked. You still have both, I believe. The green one. The first one you gave me. Leo stopped walking, turning to face her under the glow of a street lamp. I'd like to return it to you. Margaret frowned in confusion. But why? It's yours now. Because, Leo said softly, I'd like to ask if I might come calling properly. Not as someone you helped, but as a man who admires you deeply. Who would like to take you to dinner, to concerts, to museums? Who finds himself thinking of you at odd moments during the day, wondering what would make you smile? He took a deep breath. And I can't do that while wearing your late husband's scarf. It wouldn't be right. Margaret's heart, which she had thought permanently retired from such matters, gave a surprising flutter. Oh, she said faintly. Too soon? Leo asked, watching her face carefully. I understand if it is. Richard was your great love. I would never presume to replace him. No one could, Margaret agreed. Then, with a small smile that felt both terrifying and right, she added, but perhaps there's room in life for different kinds of love, for new beginnings, even at our age. Leo's face transformed with hope. Is that a yes to dinner, then? It's a yes to possibility, Margaret said carefully, to seeing where this friendship might lead. Slowly is perfect, Leo assured her. We have time. They continued their walk home, not quite touching but closer than before, two artists finding their way together through a world suddenly rich with color and light and second chances. As for the green cashmere scarf, it found a new home, neither around Leo's neck nor in Margaret's drawer of memories, but framed in a shadow box that hung in the community center's entrance hall. Beneath it, a small plaque read simply, "Never underestimate the power of a single act of kindness." It may change two lives instead of one.